So, welcome to my third interview of What Women Want Practical Pointers for Revolutionary Relationships. In my third interview, I wanted to speak to someone whose practice centers around the creative process and healing trauma. So, I chose the beautiful, amazing Jacythna. Jacythna Kamor has a background in performing arts as well as several other healing modalities. She has dedicated many years of her life to help women heal past trauma. She works with women who are in high stress positions at their jobs, and her work also extends to healing loss and grief. She helps women create transformations in their lives and discover new dimensions of themselves. She primarily works with women, but does also see some men as well. With her many years of experience helping to heal and empower women, Jacythna has important information to help us unpack the question of what women want. It is my pleasure to introduce Jacythna Kamor. Jacythna, good morning.
Hi. Good
Thank you.
morning. Good morning. So lovely
Yeah,
to
thank you
be
so
with
much for
you.
being a part of this summit
Oh,
for What
here.
Women Want. And I'm just very excited that you would bring your expertise to the platform here. So thank you so much for being with me today and for this interview. Um, First of all, I'd like the audience to know a little bit about you. If
Sure.
you could just give us a few details of what you do. I know you have an extended background, but but just a few things that might be pertinent for our conversation today.
Yeah, kind of the overview of my journey is that, I started in the performing arts and always had one foot in the healing arts just because of my own trauma history. And and then moving into I did some work in leadership development, and now I've really put it all together and found that using what I call the embodied imagination is, and it's a creative process, but it's a really powerful process for healing trauma. And so I work with, mostly people in various kinds of leadership positions who have, high stress, high demands, high visibility, and which comes with its own unique set of issues, and needing that quiet, safe space to be able to work through compounded stress, which can lead to, what's called small t trauma, as well as their own big T trauma. I have people come to me with, who've gone through tremendous loss and grief, and how to get through that when they have, so many demands on them, and that there's always a way through, and usually there's a process of transformation that happens, growth, healing, spiritual opening and awakening. So it even trauma and grief and these kinds of things can become a really rich, beautiful process and carry people and lead people to new dimensions of themselves and new ways of creating their lives and what they really, really want. And so I primarily work with women. I do have some male clients as well who are open to the feminine and want to develop that dimension of themselves. But yeah, so I love the topic of this, Aurora. I just think it's a beautiful, important message, especially today with what's going on in the world. And, how do we create all of the best conditions for our feminine well-being and awakening and empowerment and all of the gifts of that, because it's such a rich dimension of our being, whatever gender.
Very true. Very true. Well, you are leading me perfectly, as you would probably do anyway, because you're so intuitive, to our very first question, and that is, what does it mean to be a woman today in this environment that we're in today? What do you
Yeah.
think it means to be a woman today?
Yeah, I think having a process and a safe space. So, a lot of the feminine energy and the deeper pleasure and deeper sources of creativity thrive in safety and security. And if we don't have that given on the outside, of course, a certain amount of it is, concrete and physical and practical, But sometimes we have safety around us, relative safety around us, but it doesn't feel safe on the inside. So how do we create those conditions of safety on the inside so that that natural yin energy, that natural feminine energy can begin to flow and move very organically and naturally? So a couple of ways of achieving that. One is working with really impeccable boundaries. And I love the book. I want to do a little promo for her name is Terry Cole, and she wrote a book called Boundary Boss. But it's really the best book I've read on boundaries, and I've read all of them or many of them. And she talks about that the quality of our life really depends on our ability to set boundaries, and that setting boundaries is simply speaking our truth in the moment and being able to say our yeses and nos to all kinds of situations and dynamics, and that it's really a masterful work of art, that it takes a long time to master that ability to set boundaries, especially if we've been encouraged not to. And it can bring up all kinds of reactionary emotions and guilt inside of us, not even the other people, which that might be an issue as well, but just inside of us. Sometimes, like, we set a boundary and there's a kind of a backlash, or I feel guilty, or do I even have the right to set that boundary or say that, what that need is, what that yes is, what that no is. And so it can take time to develop this, but it's essential, because then we start to have space, and then some of those natural energies and our natural sense of pleasure and well-being and the sense of being able to create our own life starts to take place. So that's one way. The other
But
way,
before you move on, so
yeah.
yeah, so I'm just gonna ask a question. So, like, what I'm hearing from you is part of what it means to be a woman today is to know yourself enough so that you can create boundaries that are clear, and that women today are are learning that, are addressing that. And so I have, before you move on, I have a question: is why do you think women don't feel safe and protected? And why do you think they don't create clear boundaries?
Ooh, that's a huge topic.
I know.
A whole nother talk. Um, oh my gosh. I mean, I'm going to go to my essential belief in this, which is that because of collective and intergenerational trauma, all men and women are dealing with residual trauma.
Right.
And the residual trauma is embedded in and coded in the yin energy, the feminine energy. So when we stop the doing and we start feeling and being, those trauma patterns and emotions are there. And we haven't had the education, or we lost it if we had it at some point, or some cultures have it. We haven't integrated, brought forward, or developed the ability to heal and transform that trauma. So when we bump into it, we try to control it and do things around it. And so it gets then projected onto and acted out with women, but it's about the feminine. Men don't feel safe in their feminine usually either. So what we're dealing with is a huge world of collective and intergenerational trauma, and the lack of ability to move through it and transform it. So in these collective trauma themes, like Thomas Hubble talks about permafrost, which is a kind of layer of the energy body, layer of our emotions and in our body that just is in a constant deep freeze, and it never melts to flow again. The Thomas Hanna, who developed the movement re-education process called somatics, talks about somatic amnesia. So they're
Okay.
similar. So we get somatic amnesia and this permafrost where we've even lost touch with those parts of ourselves. And as Carl Jung talked about, then what we lose touch with, we often project out.
Yes. Yes.
So I think we're dealing with something that is not just gender oriented in terms of women. I think the feminine realm of us, that energy, doesn't feel safe because of not knowing how to deal with trauma. The beauty of the world today is that we have so much information and so many wonderful, powerful, efficient practices to heal trauma. So on one hand, we have, kind of things escalating and things, feeling more out of control, but we also have more ability and more ways and means to heal and deal with that trauma.
Yeah. What do you think or feel that women need or want from men?
I mean, of course, it's unique to each person. So again, going back to what you stated so wisely earlier, that it's getting to know ourselves in order to be able to set boundaries and or ask what we need. So that's something very nuanced and very unique. I think though that the larger topics are, and before we even go to asking a man, I think it's really learning how to be with, to melt that permafrost, to understand our own subtle body, our own dynamics of pleasure, and how to heal and how to create internal safety. One of the things Terry Cole talks about in her book on boundaries is some of the hardest boundaries are the ones we set with ourselves.
Right.
So,
Absolutely.
with whether it's with food or, rest or whatever, sometimes just our own internal boundaries are a mess. And so or traumatized or
Exactly.
patterned in a way or habituated in a way that we don't even feel safe inside ourselves. So even if a wonderful man comes along who wants to give the world to his woman, she and again, I don't know how you're dealing with gender here, but it can be in any dynamic, but it's it's learning how to receive and learning how to understand what our own nuances are, what our own um, needs are, desires are, so that we can communicate that with a man. So I think a couple of things generally, though, given the world and given our history, is if men can understand that in terms of their own feminine. So rather than demanding the feminine from a woman, learning to cultivate and understand their own inner feminine and heal their own trauma patterns so that they can have their own pleasure body, their own subtle body experiences. And then to understand some of the collective issues for women and have some patience and compassion for that. And then learning how to dialogue around some of that. But again, this is predicated on the woman taking full responsibility for her own part in the dynamic and not, I think where things get stuck is when both people are demanding something or one is demanding and the other is submitting. That's when things get, there's not a deeper connection. There's not the respect. There's not the real intimacy and listening and tuning into each other. So I
So,
think teamwork is
so,
big.
so what I'm hearing is that, there's a situation and like let's just say there's a woman who doesn't trust herself. She has a problem with her own boundaries. She doesn't even know what her boundaries might be. And you're a man and you're in a relationship with this woman and she's not even conscious of it. Like right now we're having this conversation and she's not in the room having this conversation. How could a man be able to approach and pull out from his partner
Mm.
that part of her that would allow him to um, be trustworthy or to open up the conversation of these are the boundaries that I want and also I'm assuming that once we have boundaries, then we can also open up and let go more because we know that those boundaries are going to be kept. And so, how would you coach someone in approaching? Because I think it's very hard to have one person awake in a relationship and the other person is like, how do you catch them up?
For men, I think three things. One is creating some basic safety. So, and it may be a co-creation, and that would happen, I would say, by asking questions. So really asking some good, intelligent questions, first and foremost around how can I create safety for you? What would feel safe for you? The other, I think, is to allow space. So being there, kind of, we call in the therapeutic world holding. So it's an energetic holding so that you're you're present and lovingly neutral. So you're simply present with the other person's experience and giving them space to have their experience or explore the answers to the questions if a question is asked. And as we know, yin fills empty space. So sometimes when there's a little more space rather than the man kind of coming in with, too many questions or firing questions or demands, or it's giving that holding space that the yin has a chance to emerge and fill in, and then asking some specific questions around, I think, first and foremost, safety, and next around pleasure and satisfaction, fulfillment, connection, and how to create more conditions of love for both people, for everyone involved.
That's really beautiful. And I was thinking that sometimes, a yang energy is active and I got to fix things and let me figure. So you're talking about opening up this space and then just waiting. And that's sometimes a discipline to just, because, I think we're always afraid of like, there's not, she's not responding or he's not responding, something must be wrong, or, rather than just allowing it to be open and taking that time is really beautiful. And you were also talking about, the masculine also balancing themselves up, out with by, looking at their own inner feminine and having, yin experiences. What are things that men could do to just have more yin experiences, and describe even what yin means?
Mhm. So, I mean, you're more of the expert in this, but for me, when I say the word yin, just again to take it out of gender, the yin energy to me is about being and flow, and it's an isness. So the yang that the yang is more radiant, active, and the yin is more of just that being, that fullness, that flow. And for men, and women, but I say the three ways to develop that are through breath, what's called pendiculation, and imagination, embodied imagination, or idiokinesis, which is ideo is the idea, so the image. Kinesis is through the body. So
Mm.
we can sometimes do visualizations and it's just very disconnected. It's just in our mind. But how do we connect
Ooh,
the imagination into and through the
yeah,
body? So
that's
it's
awesome. Yes.
it's very important and very powerful. And it's how, by the way, it's how hypnosis works. When hypnosis works, it's because that embodied imagination comes alive and is able to really change deep energy in the body, in the emotional body. So it's very important. And pendiculation is part of that. So pendiculation are the movements that it's what happens in what's called kind of dance therapy form called authentic movement. And it's basically, kind of when we wake up, it's yawning, it's stretching, but stretching not like I'm going to do a yoga asana now. It's not stretching with passive muscles. I'm doing it. It kind of emerges from the inside. It's more organic. So, when our pets wake up in the morning, they do a little downward
Right.
dog, they do a little, it's like this, it's this sensual, active, moving the energy, waking everything up, and it arises from the inside. So that's a form of pendiculation. And it's really important because we don't do that. Again, we go into that, got to get it done, got to go to exercise class, got to go to yoga, which is great. We need that too. We just have so much of that we don't often take time to be in that more sensual pendiculation kind of mode. And we don't use the power of the embodied imagination. And then, of course, in and through all of that is breath and how we breathe, and being able to slow down our breath, deepen our breath, move our breath in ways that help the other two. They all kind of
Yeah.
interconnect. And I think that's one way. And then the embodied imagination can take a trauma pattern. Or so if we go to Thomas Hubble's image of permafrost, we go to that place where there's somatic amnesia, which, we might not even be in touch with. That's the whole thing
Right.
about amnesia. We don't even know that it's frozen, but
Yeah.
all of a sudden our back goes out, or something happens physically. And it's like, oh, I guess I was like, kind of deadened there, or haven't been using my body in the right way. So when we move into that and we start to release that, sometimes some emotions can come up, or some of these old
Yeah.
pains and traumas. And of course, then we were like, brace against it. We don't want to go there. But if we understand that moving through that is actually going to take us into more pleasure, deep relief and release. So we don't trust the process of healing because we didn't have the tools and we didn't know how to do it before. So I think for men, really working with their own body, slowing down, moving in their own yin energy, and which is just comfortable and pleasurable and sensual. And for women to have a realm of sensuality to some degree, some women need more, some women need less, but to be able to share in that realm of the sensual requires those three tools.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm really hearing is really being in your body, like getting very intimate with your body on a regular basis. That's part of the yin, is this going within. And
Jump in with that though, because it's tricky about being in the body, because if we don't use the embodied imagination,
right,
sometimes
right.
we think that like going for a run is being in my
Yes.
body, which
Yeah.
is okay. But
Yeah.
this is a little different. This is really being in this, what's called the subtle body,
The subtle
the
body.
energy
Yeah,
body.
the energy body. But I'm also hearing that there's like a mind connection with that. So it's like like the tribe, body, soul, mind, all of those things together. Um, how would you, like, let's say you have a couple, and and you could just do an exercise like this together. How could you start that? Like even in the morning, like waking up, and because I loved all this that you were doing. I all wanted to do it with you. And like how could a couple just, like really off the top of your head, how could you just wake up and say, we're going to take 3 minutes and just do this? What would it look like? What we just throw that out there
Yeah, totally. That's a
into the
wonderful
world.
question. Well, I love, I'm developing this course on sleep because of so many issues with insomnia. And one of the things I talk about is when you wait, the first, in the Tibetan tradition, they talk about, the moment before you go to sleep and the moment you wake up, even before your eyes open, is the time to, in a lot of, in the practice that I learned, we would do a visualization at that time, even before eyes open, like just in bed. So it's a wonderful time to
Right
set
on.
an intention, to have an image. So maybe there's, just starting with that, like just beginning to wake up, have an image, And then begin some breathing, begin some slow, deep breathing, and tune into your body. So a lot of times we're kind of hoisting our bodies around, getting things done, but that's a wonderful time to be able to just listen. And the body is always communicating. There's always language, and pain is usually screaming. It's like, you're not listening to me. So how can we listen to some of those, again, the subtle bodies, some of those subtler messages, and just move and follow and see what happens? So if a couple is lying in bed and they're each, whether they wake up together or not, but like if one starts doing it, the other one might stir a little bit. And if they're in their own world and exploring this, pendiculation movement and what feels good, being more in that rest state in bed and horizontal, and not having to deal with gravity in the same way, and just listening and moving and seeing what feels good. Oh, I got a little tension here. I'm going to breathe into it. I'm going to imagine, butter melting, or I'm going to bring in my imagination and I'm going to move my body. And then maybe the other person stirs and then they start doing that. And then you can say, again, going back to boundaries, honey, I just want to stay with this. I just want to stay with my own exploration. Or it might lead into some sensual exploration of each other. And, you can even communicate for a while. Does this feel good? How does this feel? And get to know each other's sensuality. And it may become more intense and turn into sexual play, and it might not.
Yeah.
So I think slowing it down to the extent that everybody has and stays with their body, full body experience. And that does require trust, as you mentioned earlier, that like if my partner wants to just stay in their own pendiculation and they don't want to connect right now, does that say something about me? No, it
Yeah.
says something about that person.
Yeah.
So communicating in that way, building that trust so that everyone has plenty of time and space to explore these new ways of moving the subtle body, of developing more sensuality, finding and then moving with the yin energy, and then seeing the process of sharing and exploration together.
Yeah, you use two words I think are really important to identify, and one is sensuality and one is sexuality. And they seem similar, but I think that they're a little bit different. And, the way that you described it, sensuality feels a little bit more yin, where sexuality may feel a little more yang. And so I think that you've led us into a place of a secret of the feminine. Could you describe what sensuality is and what sexuality is, and why sensuality is so important to women, especially in terms of their sexuality?
So I feel like this is there's a whole world, a whole realm that is about what we're talking about, having the space and the time to let it move and unfold. So a lot of times we have a little bit of sensuality and we jump right into the sexual act. So sexuality, I would say, is also much more nuanced and much bigger. And the sexual act is an expression of the sexual. So now it's getting a little more tantric in the sense of really realizing that sexual energy is a vehicle for increasing other states of consciousness, for healing, for developing more sensuality, for kinds of experiences, embodied and also mental states of bliss. So I would say that the kind of the container for all of that is it's a little bit like a musical scale. So it's not like this note is, they're all notes, but it's a range of notes. And that's what we often don't have. Is usually we have like a couple of
Right,
notes. We're trying
right.
to sing a song or create a symphony of a relationship.
You know, it's
Notes, exactly. So what we want to do is learn and develop and begin to hear. Sometimes people don't hear notes. So we want to listen. Again, that goes back to the somatic amnesia, is we want to learn to listen to these other notes learn to sing them, learn to resonate with them, so that we have a whole world, a whole playground of all kinds of experiences. And some of that might create more intimacy with a couple than the sexual act. And
Yes.
some of these other ways of working with bliss energy and sensual energy are very intimate and very vulnerable.
Yeah.
A lot of this, what we're talking about, which goes back to some of the trauma themes, is that this is very vulnerable. And thank you, Brene Brown, for helping us realize the power of vulnerability and what a beautiful part of humanity is, because it's how we feel and live fully and connect and relate and love. And the excruciating vulnerability she talks about is trauma. And there are many, many, many ways to heal that trauma.
I was just, funnily enough, I was just listening to Brene Brown this morning when I couldn't sleep. I put her on,
Yeah.
and she talks a lot about shame, and so I don't think that we can not talk about that a little bit in what you're talking about in terms of being in the body, because there's so much shame, both in the masculine and feminine energy. How like when you're talking about going in and now this deliciousness, and what if you come up against shame? What do you do?
So shame, what we know now from all the trauma research, is that shame is automatically a byproduct of trauma. If we have shame, we have trauma. And everybody has some degree of trauma, right?
Yeah.
Again, varying degrees. So shame is always that. And there are, so the first, usually it's so it's so uncomfortable, and we sometimes create a story with shame, is that, and therefore it means I am unlovable, therefore it means this, therefore it means that. So I would say to slow that story down, and again, that spaciousness, that holding that we talked about, simply being with the sensations of it. And when you focus on the sensations of shame, it does a couple of things. It creates that holding space. It also starts to repattern the brain so that we develop that, in meditation, what we call witness consciousness. So there's a kind of mindfulness with shame rather than it is my identity. So that's the problem with shame, is that when it feels like it goes boom, like an arrow right into, oh, this is who I am and I'm stuck here and that's all there is, and I got to get away from it. When we can slow that down and allow it to be and not make it about our identity, and start to observe the sensations of it, then we start to witness it, and allowing it creates compassion and love, which is how we heal shame.
Right. Well, I know Brene says, guilt is I did something wrong. Shame is I am something wrong, right? And so everything is about getting it out and seeing it. So you're talking about having a neutral mind and watching it.
Watching it, yeah. And it's, we can't always be, when we're in it, it's hard to be completely neutral, but we aim towards it. We
Yeah.
try to
Yeah.
be a little bit more observant, and staying in the body, staying with, ooh, that shape makes my chest go in, it makes my
Yeah.
shoulders go up. It's like, watch what happens in your body. It's a great way to bring the mind more into the observer role rather than the hijack, the being caught in it.
Yeah. Because, like what you're talking about is is what pushing through what we've always like been up against, that armor. So like many of us know that there are things there, and I'm just not going to go there. I know that that feeling is not going to feel good, and so even in relationships we do that. And so what you're talking about is staying and staying and staying and just seeing what's on the other side, that thing that we're really afraid to feel or experience or even admit and recognize. And so, any suggestions on how to find the courage to do that, within ourselves, because some of times we have this thought is like, if I feel that, I'll die. Or if I feel that, like, I won't know who I am anymore. I can't look at that.
And this is where it's a kind of a Mobius strip, like you can't really separate anything out. And I always love conversations with you, Aurora, because we just started to go there right as you were right before you were asking that question, which is that because staying sometimes it feels like white knuckles, grit teeth, are gonna stay, it's like miserable. So that's not the kind of staying or holding or patience that we're talking about. And this is where the kind of triumvirate of the pendiculation, the breath, and the embodied imagination are so important. So if the shame comes up, definitely going into that witness consciousness, but also using breath,
Yeah,
using a little bit of movement so that you don't go into the freeze response, and some embodied imagination. And this is where you can use a bit of a process where you can, what's an image? So as you're observing your physical sensations around the shame, is there an image that comes up? And then with that image, what would that image need? Like if you were the director of the movie, what would that image need? So say maybe the shame is, you see yourself, or you even have a memory of yourself as a child, kind of like, again, we talked earlier about, the chest going in, the shoulders going up, and it's like being ostracized or being, kicked out and just feeling really horrible and unloved. Well, what would that child need?
right.
Becoming the director and giving that child, welcoming that exile, welcoming that child back in, welcoming and warming and wrapping a warm comforter and giving that child a hug, for
Yes,
example. So you want it, and then breathing through all of it, moving, breathing, and imagination. The thing about is it's when things get stuck. That's it, whether it's our story or our body. That's usually because we're beings of movement, which doesn't, it's not always the higher end of the active movement, but there's a whole realm of slow, sensual, flowing movement that is more of the yin range.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So what I'm hearing is how important it is to move into yin for healing. Like really how important it is, and yin is for men and women both. That's
And then the yang becomes in service to that. So then what are the actions? What
right.
are the conversations? What are the things that I can do to help create more space for the yin?
Yeah,
And just, we're talking about movement and the importance of movement through all of this. And let's just say that, when there's healing, sometimes there's also just that still point, that's
mm,
deep stillness. So it's not to say there is no stillness. It's just sometimes we need to kind of move through things in order for that pool of stillness to arise or be present and feel safe in that as well.
yeah. What can a man do to make a woman feel more desirable or beautiful?
Mm. Uh, I think going back to um, Gary Chapman's work on love languages and really understanding the woman's love language. So, for example, if she thrives in verbal affirmations, to tell her regularly that, she's beautiful and how much he adores her, and just keep saying it, like, don't stop. If it's, gifts, like, get to know her style, get to know her preferences, get to know what she likes, like again, listening, studying, watching, and maybe for a while asking, and then finding the gifts that really make her feel seen and special, and are in alignment with her own sense of style and what she loves, her sense of beauty. Acts of service. And again, it's like the love language is an attunement. I think attunement is something that we've really lost touch with, is how do we really listen and attune to each other, and make those subtle adjustments to really communicate through that person's love language in a way that makes them feel just like a flower getting all the water, all the sunlight, all the earth, everything she needs to bloom fully. And I use flowers a lot to, and I love orchids because they don't need too much, they don't need too little, they need just the right amount for them to bloom. It's like if
You are
it's
a
too
genius
much,
with orchids. I've seen your orchids.
I
They're
used to
amazing.
call crystal orchid healing because it's like orchids are just so magnificent for that. They're such teachers around the feminine because it's very specific, and that's the attunement piece.
I love this word attunement. I think it's really a good word for a couple to adopt, to just be thinking of like, how are we attuned today? And what you're talking about is paying attention, being curious, taking the time, even if it's, just one moment, to really see that other person and figure out how to attune to them. Any, like, we live busy lives, as we already said. How could you just practice that a little by little in your daily life?
Hmm. So again, starting with asking a question and maybe kind of creating an event around it. So maybe asking, where would you like to, I'd love to take you out to dinner. Where would you love to go? And then making the reservation, going out to dinner, and then over dinner, having it be a little more intentional. So rather than just, chatting or randomly or just talking about the food, really asking some questions about, what do you love? What lights you up? What makes you feel safe? What, have you thought about um, some things that would help you relax a little bit more? Or, if you had a crazy wild fantasy. So a lot of times if we're more practical, we don't let ourselves really
Mm.
go out of the box in terms of that. So sometimes I love to ask people like, okay, if there were no conditions involved, no limitations, what's your wildest fantasy version of, and it could be just, simply connecting, sharing, sensuality, relaxation, healing, safety, passion, just asking those kinds of questions and letting her needs and desires and creative imagination inform, and then the man can be of service to that and bring in, you know practices or experiences or conditions that really, he needs to kind of take note of it, and then he can go to work around that it's more attuned rather than just, well, other women like this gift, or, I read this book or I read this article. Really having that kind of conversation and listening.
It's very specific to her.
Yes.
So I'm going to give you another problem. You're good at solutions. So let's just say you're a man and you've tried to do everything, and you're at this point. It was like nothing works. She's not interested in sex. She's not interested in anything. She's just interested in, I can't connect with her, and I just want to give up. I just, I'm just done. Nothing works. And obviously we know that that attitude is also probably, self-fulfilling prophecy, right? What can you give to someone who's feeling that, that hopelessness,
Mhm.
how can you get out of that? And what needs to happen? What needs to shift? How can you pivot?
Again, I think it's different for each person and each couple, so it's a little bit complex. But again, I think it goes back to, and it's really hard to have patience when you've had the kind of white knuckle patience for a long time and nothing has worked. So I really want to have compassion for that it's very, very hard because, you feel like your own needs aren't getting met. There are a couple of things. One is that, again, coming back to the opportunity for oneself. So, I've worked with couples where there's a kind of sexual discrepancy or a split, and for the person who's more desirous, coming back into a more deeper exploration of self and healing and realizing And I'm not just talking about masturbation, like I'm talking about a whole way of opening and moving that energy that is meaningful and fulfilling and healing and profound. And sometimes the other person feels that happening in that person, and they feel it in the atmosphere, and it starts to wake things up in the other person. So a lot of relationship happens energetically. And I think women tend to go more towards verbal, and men tend to go more towards sexual connection, physical sexual connection, and opening up that world in between of energy communication, energy dynamics is where a lot of healing and reparation can happen. So I would say for the man to kind of, for himself to start to explore tantrically, to start to slow down um, his own patterns and his own habits and tendencies, get to know them and see if he can melt through and develop something new, which is going to feel better and going to bring him more in touch with his own feminine and fulfill some of that anyway. And it might even create an atmosphere where the woman feels like she's not having to jump into a cold bath, or she's not having to like come into some kind of demand, but she might start to also melt open and ease into that with him. And then again, going back to questions, and and it may be the quality of questions or the kind of questions, like, rather than, well, why aren't you this, or why is this happening, or why do you never, like, coming back to, what's going, just open-ended questions, what's, called inquiry, like, just what what are you experiencing right now? What's happening for you? Can you tell me a little bit more? And gets tricky because you don't want to take it personally and feel like, oh, this is, go into the shame place, or if you do, like, to have that be a process, but just simply like, you know why are you bracing against me? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? I'm curious, I want to know more.
Yeah.
Those are a couple ways to begin.
Yeah, yeah, beautiful. Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. I'd actually like to ask the question from the feminine perspective. What if you're with a man that you've tried everything with, and you just cannot seem to connect? He seems very involved with the rest of his life and world, and maybe the only way that he is interested in connecting is sexually, and nothing else, or maybe he's not even interested in that. How can you begin to connect with him energetically, like you've been talking about? What ways can a woman start to, because I know one of the things Byron Katie always says, it only takes one person to have a good relationship, and that's really taking 100% responsibility 100% of the time, right? So yeah, how could a woman uh, approach, and maybe it's similar, but maybe there's something else.
So I would say there's a little bit of a paradox here, because on one hand, absolutely, and this is a lot of times when I work with people who have that discrepancy in their relationship, it's like all about the immense world that we don't even know about that can be developed, that is completely fulfilling, and we can become that. And I've seen this many times, where as the woman becomes that, the man starts to, sometimes the field between them starts to change. Now, there's also the paradox is the opposite is also true, is that it does take two to have a relationship. So I don't, there are situations where it is irreconcilable. And that also has the courage to honor and respect that. If one or the other is absolutely no matter what, and the person does all their inner work, they've created their own world, they've created their own sensuality, they're fulfilled, they're not, there's still a dance and a dynamic. And, I love that line in The Misfits when Marilyn Monroe says something like, if I'm gonna be alone, I'd rather be on my own. I think that's the line. But
Yeah.
it's that, like, sometimes it actually, then you actually have more freedom, and you can, maybe visit, dating again, but so it might actually be better to be on one's own. But way before that, like that's, the extreme version of it. There's so much that can be done. And it's the same for the man or the woman. The woman can develop all of her sensuality, her flow, her healing, her sense of connection in all kinds of ways, and heal some abandonment trauma or rejection trauma, heal the shame
Mm.
until she's in her bliss body, until she's in her field of fullness and flow. And oftentimes that does shift the dynamic in the relationship as well. It's very powerful. I mean, I was often say, one of the what where women have a huge amount of power but often don't realize it is in creating atmosphere.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So that the feminine is that atmosphere. So you feel it, like you go into a home and it just feels warm and cozy. You go into another one, it just feels cold. Even both might be aesthetically really beautiful, but there's an atmosphere, there's an energetic atmosphere. And a woman being able to tap into that and heal that and increase that in herself is naturally going to emanate and create that in the atmosphere. And I also always talk about women birth the men, so biologically but also in consciousness. So when you bring, without talking, like women's masculine tends to get very verbal, but if you bring that energy quietly into a space, if the man is healthy enough and responsive enough, he might just find his way into that ocean, and the dolphins meet and have a great a great swim and a great fuck, so, but it's creating that. And we have so much power in that. We just don't have the tools. A lot of times we just don't know how to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I like that solution because uh, it's so easy to blame the other person for not giving you what you want or making you happy. And obviously, we know that we're responsible for ourselves to make us happy. We're responsible for our own bliss. And that's where we get power. That's where we empower. Yeah. Um, this has been really, really insightful. If you could only give one piece of advice to men on how to approach and be with a woman, what would that be?
Mm. And what's coming actually kind of intuitively is breathe, slow down,
Wow. Yeah,
and then
I like that.
just start with that. There's much more, of course, but just start with breathe, slow down, tune in.
Yeah.
And that can be
Oh,
asking questions or simply feeling.
that is awesome. Sometimes the simpler, the better. That is so perfect.
And that can be
Oh,
done. That's the beauty of the simplicity, is it can be done anytime, anywhere.
yeah.
It
Just
doesn't
remember to
have a
do
big
it.
ritual to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Little sticker you put on your computer, breathe, and
Yeah.
that's it. Yeah, yeah.
Oh my God.
Jacythna, thank you so much. This was
Thank
such a
you.
beautiful conversation. I learned so much, and I think this is going to be so helpful for people. Thank you for taking time today for
Oh,
this
it's always a
conversation.
joy to be with you. And thank you. Thank you for asking me. And
You're so welcome,
if
and a
this is
pleasure.
helpful. And yeah, I look forward to hearing all the other speakers and to seeing you again, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. This isn't the last time we'll be seeing each other, believe me.
All
Okay, thank
right.
you.
Thank you, my dear. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye bye.